I'm delighted to be able to speak to you tonight and to introduce the co-editors of this issue. I'm going to say just a few short words about Rise itself, about the journal, and then I'll introduce the co-editors, Laura Sydora and Robert Brazeau, and they will introduce then some of the contributors to this issue who'll speak a little about their contribution before we open up to our attendees and participants to discuss more broadly the issues that are involved in the issue itself. So just to say a few words about Rise to begin with, we are an international open access, peer-reviewed and multidisciplinary journal. We publish both articles and reviews in Irish studies, and one of our principal aims is the publication of new and innovative research within and between the broad range of disciplines and areas engaged with Irish studies. And that's increasingly a growing and increasingly multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary area that includes not just literature but history, film and visual culture, politics, translation studies, music studies and the social sciences more broadly. We publish both themed multidisciplinary issues such as we're launching tonight, but we also do non-themed issues. In fact, we will be launching very shortly a new non-themed issue which will accumulate over time and will be as part of our effort to expedite the publication process and bring work to readers and bring research out more quickly. We're aiming to have an open issue that will grow as we receive and as articles are accepted, and successfully go through our peer review process. If you are interested in submitting to Rise, or if you have either a themed issue idea or if you have a non-themed article that you're interested in submitting, please you can email us at rise, R-I-S-E, at EFACIS.eu. And we also have accept proposals for review articles, which should be forwarded to our reviews editor, Professor Sylvia Mikowski, at Rise Reviews, again at EFACIS, EFACIS.eu. We accept articles in both English and in the Irish language. So if you have work in Irish, we'd be delighted to consider that also for publication. Just to say a few before I introduce our editors tonight, some thanks as always is due to these. All issues of Rise depend on a broad range of people contributing and making it possible for our publications to happen. Before I introduce and thank our editors of this issue, I want to thank the editorial board of Rise for their ongoing support in making Rise possible and in reviewing articles as they come in, and that our editorial board include Joost Augustine, Elke Docher, Katrina Renhack and Daniela Tianova, and also Sylvia Mikowski. I'm delighted, Sylvia, delighted to see you can join us tonight. Sylvia is also our reviews editor, so Sylvia would be accepting any proposal there are for book reviews from that you'd like considered for our journal. I'd also like to give a special thanks to the EFACIS coordinator, Seán Del Tor, who's helping us on the technical side tonight, but also has been extraordinary support in the Rise journal in terms of the ongoing support in making the journal possible, hosting it online, and the close reading of articles for each issue. I also want to thank our current intern, Sarah Budroni, who also was an extraordinary help in, again, the kind of meticulous and slow process that is involved in bringing each article and each issue to publication. I just want to mention one other thing, non-Rise thing. I'll come back at the end, but in case we may lose some attendees or people may have to go, as well as this roundtable, EFACIS has a broader range of events that are hosted over the coming months, and I want to extend apologies of our president, Katarina Ransack, who unfortunately can't be with us tonight because of a family emergency. But if she was, she would remind you all of the EFACIS PhD seminar, which will take place at the end of August this year. This is a really important initiative for EFACIS support emerging researchers, and it happens in Leuven. RISE is the dedicated journal of EFACIS, the European Federation of Associations and Centres on Irish Studies, and has been EFACIS provides the support and facilitates the work that we do in the publications that we have. So at this point, I want to thank the editors and introduce the editors of this issue 5.1 on Irish sexual liberation and its literatures. This has been a really fascinating issue, and as you may have noticed in the title, this is part one of a double issue. The second part will be arriving later in the year, and this has been partly because of the extraordinary response that I know Rob and Laura received when the CFP for this issue was announced some time ago. So I'm just going to introduce Rob and Laura, and then we'll allow them to chair proceedings and to introduce the contributors who are with us tonight. So Robert Brazeau is Associate Professor of Irish Studies at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Canada. He is the co-editor of Eco-Joyce, The Environmental Imagination of James Joyce, and the author of journal articles and book chapters on James Joyce, James Synge, Seán O'Casey, Maeve McGuckie and Anne Enright, and a number of other modernist and contemporary Irish writers, and is currently completing a book-length study of the works of James Synge. Laura Sydora is an assistant professor of English at Concordia University in Edmonton, who specialises in Irish and British women's cultural history and production in the 20th century. Her research focuses on the distinctly textual forms of feminism during this historical period, specifically the role of the periodical press in the mid-20th century Irish women's liberation movement. And she's published articles in Women's Studies, Irish Studies Review, and in our Journal Review of Irish Studies in Europe. So I'm going to hand over now to Rob and Laura. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Great.
That's wonderful.
Thanks. Thank you so much. Oh, Rob, did you want to start or?
Oh no, go ahead. I mean, I think that we had planned out that Laura would give a few introductory remarks regarding how the project came together for us in its earliest stages, and then how it developed over time, and then we will then go through ask contributors to go as they appear in the table of contents, and I think we all know the order. We can direct people as they go if they don't. But because three of our contributors can't be here today, I'm going to just offer very, very quick summaries of those three papers, and they're all right in the middle, coincidentally enough. So we'll have Naoise's paper, and then I'll just give a quick rundown of the other papers, and then we will conclude with Michael Cronin's paper and then Michael Lydon's paper. So yeah, so great. So very informal, and then we'll have questions for all of our contributors at the end, and we'll monitor the chat as we go if people have questions that they want to put in the chat, or if at the end of it you would like to unmute yourself and ask your question, that would be great too. So
Great. All right. Awesome. Thank you. Good morning or evening, everyone, depending on your current geographical location. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy or leisurely summer schedules to join us here today for the launch of Speaking Out When It's Dangerous. As Seán said, my name is Laura Sydora, and I'm joined here today by my esteemed co-editor and co-moderator, Robert Brazeau. I don't think I've ever actually called you Robert before, but on behalf of Rob and myself, I'd like to welcome you all to the first of a two-part issue on Irish sexual liberation and its literatures, as well as thank Seán and the editorial board at RISE for hosting this event. So I prepared something a little more formal just to start, because that's just my style, but I thought I would tell you just a little bit about what gave rise to this project first, before I introduce our contributors. And so Rob and I have been trying to find a home for this issue for a couple of years and are really grateful for both the timing and means through which it came together with RISE. Admittedly, when we initially proposed this issue to Seán, I don't think Rob or I had any set expectations about what we would like to see from potential contributors. But we're generally motivated by two impetuses. So the first was an interest in really reading the relationship between sexual politics and social transformation throughout the 20th and 21st century, in order to complicate before and after narratives of social change. And the second was really a desire to explore modes of theoretical engagement beyond those simply grounded in post-colonial studies alone. And these are fairly broad imperatives that are both, I think, personally and professionally motivating. And so we were really delighted when what emerged from our selected contributors was a series of critically and theoretically engaged essays that coincidentally span the 20th century, from the formative years of political nation building to the contemporary years of the Celtic Phoenix, and works that reimagine the narratives of social, political, and economic transformation across varied sites of cultural intervention. And this attention to a range of literary and cultural sites of production is perhaps what interests me the most about the works that are published in this issue here today. And so in many ways, what these essays do then is to interrogate hegemonic conventions of gendered and sex belonging in Ireland, past and present. And at a time when state efforts to prescribe a conservative, hegemonic, and cultural moral order are increasingly becoming a global impulse, such as we see in the United States right now. I think these essays have as much to teach us about the state of sexual politics in the past as they do about the stakes of their future as well. And so with this in mind, I'd like to begin to introduce 3 of our 6 contributors who we are very fortunate to have with us here today, including Naoise Murphy, Dr. Michael Cronin, and Dr. Michael Leuven. And as Rob noted, 3 of our contributors weren't able to make it, and so Rob will be giving summaries of Cara Delay's Estibalit Exeras and Phyllis Boumans' essays in the middle of these presentations here today as well. And so just to give you a sense of how things are going to proceed, Rob already did a little bit of that, but we'll introduce each of the contributors before they give their short presentations. And then Rob will, of course, give those summaries for us in the middle. We welcome any questions that you have for contributors throughout the presentations. You're welcome to type them into a chat box or reserve them until the end. But we do ask that you sort of wait to address those questions specifically to our contributors at the end, where we can hopefully engage our contributors in more of a conversation or dialogue. So if that sounds all right to everyone, then I would like to introduce our first very thought-provoking contributor, Naoise Murphy. Naoise is a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge Centre for Gender Studies, who is currently researching and writing on queerness in the work of mid-20th century Irish writers, including Kate O'Brien and Elizabeth Bowen, and whose essay begins our issue. And with that, I'd like to turn our attention over to Naoise.
Thank you so much, Laura and Rob and Seán. It's been like an absolute pleasure to work on this issue. And yeah, just a delight from start to finish. Thank you all so much for putting it together. I'll be quite brief, I think. This article was based on work that I started for my master's in gender studies, using quite an eclectic range of ideas from kind of gender studies and queer studies to develop readings of these 2 kind of possibly the most prominent Irish women writers of the 20th century, so Elizabeth Bowen and Kate O'Brien. These were the writers who kind of gave me a language to understand my own kind of conflicted sense of identity as a queer person who grew up in Ireland and moved to England when I turned 18. I never kind of felt quite at home in either place and found a lot in common with the young protagonists of O'Brien's and Bowen's novels, who feel quite alienated from these nationally defined identities and drawn to queerer formulations of subjectivity that raise as many questions as they answer, but certainly agitate against national borders and nation states. So I wanted to explore that kind of mutually constitutive relationship between queerness and movement across borders through this idea of the queer transnational. And I felt that the Review of Irish Studies in Europe seemed a really appropriate venue to have that discussion. And obviously this isn't a new insight at all. The kind of queer experience of estrangement from the nation has always been central to, you know, literary production, other cultural production, and to academic criticism on queer, lesbian, gay, and women's writing. And the piece is really reliant on work by, just to name a couple of really influential people, Eivor Walsh, Siobhan Kilfeather, Geraldine Meany, Tina O'Toole, Heather Ingman, Alva Smith, many, many others. Hopefully it just brings the analysis in a couple of new directions, following some more recent developments in gender studies and queer studies. So to give a really brief overview, it draws extensively on Heather Ingman's work to argue that what makes the queer and the transnational legible as mutually constitutive in the work of O'Brien and Bowen is their engagement with the thematics of abjection. So following Julia Kristeva, her concept of the abject, those that are cast out of the national imaginary sort of return to trouble the stability of its identity and borders. So I started writing this against the backdrop of the repeal campaign. And I was thinking a lot about the experience of people crossing the Irish Sea to seek abortion as a really powerful image of abjection that was kind of occupying my mind a lot at the time. So for me, kind of locating that queer transnational movement in Irish writing was part of an effort to, in a small way, open out the horizon of possibility for Irish queers to kind of reclaim our characterization as abject in the national imaginary, and maybe start to sketch an alternative history of resistance. I think this for me is really crucially a history of non-assimilation. So the characters that take up this piece, like Anna Murphy, Mary Lavelle, Agatha Conlon, Lewis Farquhar, Eva Trout, for me are models of a kind of disidentificatory strand of queer thinking, to borrow from Munoz, sort of working on and against the stock images of this mainstream cis heteronormative culture. So whether that's the kind of dissolving effect of exile that we get in Mary Lavelle, the intrusions of a destructive terrorist sensibility in some of Bowen's work, the positionality of the enraged monster that I think Eva Trout takes up. These experiences of queer and trans abjection situate these characters in a queer transnational space. So it's a history, I think, of resistance in which queer implies, to quote Alyosha Tudor, a transing of the nation that deconstructs the assumptions of gendered and national belonging. And yeah, just to wrap up, I think post-repeal and in the kind of increasingly homo-nationalist culture that we're seeing in Ireland at the moment, I am starting to try and turn my attention more towards those who are kind of cast as abject more within the nation today. So thinking increasingly about the role of migrants, people in direct provision, the unhoused, the incarcerated, sex workers, and do queer transnational ways of thinking offer any resources for solidarity, even if maybe we won't arrive at those through the work of fundamentally quite conservative writers. I think there is value, though, in dwelling on queer experiences of exile, estrangement, following Heather Love in insisting on the roots of queer identification in shame, stigma, and abjection, to kind of be on guard against our assimilation at the cost of liberation for everyone. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
That was great. Thank you so much. So I'm going to now just offer a very quick précis of the Cara Delay's paper, Phyllis Bauman's paper, and Establitz's Vegas paper. And I decided what I would do is sort of take a couple of important quotes from the papers and then just kind of, stitch them together a little bit with some comments on just the sort of summary comments for the papers. It's interesting that as the issue was coming together, one of the things Laura and I were wanted to be alert to and wanted to see come through in the papers is the correspondent ways in which different forms of sexual liberation, that is sexual liberation for different communities in Ireland, we're sort of cross-pollinating each other, where as Cara's paper is on, and Cara's paper especially is on the rise of abortion legislation in Ireland and on secret and unhealthy abortions prior to the 1967 legislation. And so it offers a look into how different family structures were also impacted by conservative social forms. And so I'm just going to take a quick look at, and so I just want to wrap that up. So we were interested in the both andness of Irish sexual liberation within sort of heteronormative codes and how those are changing, and then sexual liberation understood as a discourse in Ireland, a slowly emerging one that was going to, one way to put it might be to say that it was going to delegitimize forms of delegitimization, like past forms of delegitimization. So communities that were experiencing forms of delegitimization, the narratives that were presiding over that process were progressively becoming dismantled and delegitimized across a fairly broad spectrum, right, of Irish public life and Irish citizenship. And so so let me take a few minutes here to just take a quick look at these three papers considered as a group, and I'll just kind of go through them a little bit cumbersomely perhaps, but I just wanted to offer some thoughts, and of course as I do so, it's really unfortunate that that our writers couldn't be here today to do this themselves, but if you have any questions, we do our best to address them. And of course, there's no substitute for going to read the papers themselves if you have time and if you have interest. So, what DeLay is looking at in her paper is, as she says in the introduction, is a larger pattern of committed heterosexual couples collaborating to seek abortion in 20th century Ireland. And for her article, she analyzes 150 criminal abortion cases in the north of Ireland and in the Republic from 1900 to 1967. And what she found, and she notes this, what she finds strikingly, she says, is that 1/4 of women seeking abortion from these years were married, and an additional 1/3 were in committed multi-year courtships or relationships. Abortions then were not accessed by those who broke sexual norms, but also by those whose sexual practices were more conformist. And that hermeneutic, I think, is what that hermeneutic impulse guides the whole of the paper, to erode the ways in which the common understanding of abortion at this time is that it was, carried out by, it was sought by people who were somehow counter to the dominant heteronormative sexual script or domestic script. But I think that, as I say right at the end, and we'll get to this in just a second, I think that one of the things that her paper asks us to do is to complicate or seriously query what we understand as domesticity at this time in Irish life. And we'll get to that in just a second. But so I just bring that up as a proviso, because as I use that term and as you see it resonate in DeLay's paper, it's going to get quite complicated by the end. Anyway, so the notion that abortion was sought by people who were sexual nonconformists, by people who were having sex outside of marriage, is one of the narratives that certainly needs to be queried. And as DeLay makes clear, that the criminalization of abortion at this time is a narrative that is very much predicated on the notion that that was presided over by the Catholic Church and by conservative forces in the government, that there was too much potential disruption to the state's moral consensus and post-colonial identity formation if abortion would it be in any way legalized, or and so the process of calling people deviant and is key to how this narrative plays out. So the emphasis in DeLay's paper is on something like the occluded history of family planning practices at a time where social and legal codes dictated that there should be more family and less planning. And that, I think, is what DeLay is getting at. The other social code that DeLay's research inquires into is something like what we might call the obverse one, the mammy martyr, who is invoked as a kind of ideal type that would the sort of stereotypical figure of this idealized mother. The moaning mammy is her negative counterpart. The smother mother, another dominant conception of the matriarchal who insists on adherence to her principles. This is from page 10 of DeLay's article. Oh, sorry, no, it's from a little bit later. Right, and she also quotes Kevin Cairns here, who describes an Irish mammy martyr who may be bitter about her role as a baby-making machine, but grudgingly accepts her misery and declining health as a godly sacrifice. And so in both cases, in case of the criminalization of abortion, and then in the obverse case of this, the ascent of this Irish this figure of the martyred mammy, there is something like an ideological analog or embodiment of pressing social codes. We can't even call them, and this is what I was alluding to earlier, we can't even call them heteronormative or domestic, because as DeLay shows, using those terms implies that there is a real or regular family that didn't pursue any planning options and just sort of let nature take its course or something. And the other very suspicious conceit of that ideological construction would be that only aberrant or deviant types behave otherwise. So DeLay's essay ends then with a theoretical challenge to break down these time-tested but completely insufficient stereotypes. And this is the conclusion that DeLay offers. Historians working in 20th century Irish women's history have affirmed that despite public prohibitions on and cultural disapproval for so many so-called deviant practices, reality did not always equal rhetoric. So here I would just insert the observation that the question of the degree to which outmoded and state-sanctioned narratives still inflect the historiography of this period is something that DeLay draws our attention to, right? So what she argues then is ordinary people navigated as best they could the terms of creating the families they wanted. The criminal abortion, that criminal abortion was prevalent island-wide in the 20th century, and that it involved careful planning on the part of women is evident. As this essay has argued, court records provide compelling evidence not only on abortion practices, but also on how married couples navigated unwanted pregnancies during the era of illegality. For stable couples, collaboration was the norm, and abortion attempts could even strengthen partnerships. For couples whose relationship was already tense or who grappled with additional stresses, such as separation during the World Wars, reproduction was even more fraught and unwanted. Pregnancies caused further tensions. And so she concludes then, as I say, by advocating on behalf of a nuanced understanding of heterosexuality, courtship, commitment, and marriage, all of which evolved in compelling and complex ways in both states throughout the 20th century. And as her paper asserts, abortion was not counter to that narrative, but was oftentimes implicit within it, was also part of how planning was conducted. And so I think the paper is a really fascinating one myself. I don't think Cara would at all object to having it known as well that the reason she couldn't be here today is because she's testifying before the South Carolina State Legislature in the context of the repeal of Roe versus Wade. So of course, a very important issue for her, and very important part of her whole makeup as an intellectual and as a citizen, of course. Okay. Phyllis Bowen's paper also looks at, and I found that this was the thread that united the two papers for me, also looks at the ways in which processes of legitimization were shifting sharply at this time. And I think this essay does a fantastic job of, and one of the things I want to look at deeper in my own research is the ways in which what Boumans calls moral censorship throughout, and that term is used in her paper, it should be noted, because a lot of the stories that were published in the Bell at this time were subject to a whole different kind of censorship, which was World War II censorship. So there's moral censorship, which is, keeping information away from an Irish public that is deemed to be better off without having that information. But there was also a couple of the pieces that were published. One piece in particular was published on the ghettoization of Jews in Dublin, was suppressed by the War Office because of concerns over state secrecy or something. But Bauman's arguments about moral censorship are about legitimizing forms of Irish sexual being, marriage childbirth outside of wedlock and single mothers, and also same-sex relationships, of course. And then also she looks at stories that are about the emergence of erotic feelings in young people. And also how that is again, the emphasis here is on legitimizing a form of subjectivity that other important state level narratives are delegitimizing at the time, that these are not. Oh yes, thank you, Laura. That's great. Yeah, from the 40s and from the 50s. That's right. And so what Boumans argues in this really fantastic paper is that there's a change in the mechanics of short story writing around the necessity of getting material through the censor. So O'Foylan, in his Seán O'Foylan, the longtime editor, one of the longtime editors of the Bell, would urge writers to use a sort of eclipsed or occluded or subtle or nuanced style and turn that into an aesthetic value. So we can't just hand the reader everything, right? And so in this wider aesthetic, so there's a way to read this wider aesthetic mandate of the short stories as offered up in the crucible of Irish censorship. This is not to say that censorship is in any way a positive thing, but only that it had to be dealt with on an aesthetic level, and that in that process of working through it, some really great short fiction was made, and a whole style of writing short fiction in this very nuanced and subtle and somewhat more eclipsed or occluded manner becomes the norm in the Bell, and it becomes the norm largely because there is this extrinsic and sort of extra literary force of the censorship board presiding over. And so it's really a miracle. And I think that Boumans does a good job of this. It's really just kind of a miracle that a lot of these stories somehow got out there. And she doesn't really say like, well, this is how it happened, or this. There is a little, like O'Foylan especially is a very well-known figure. He has a lot of what we would now call cultural capital. He seems to have quite a lot of political clout at the time as well. And so his personality definitely helps this process, but really it's just some kind of strange confluence of things that mean that these stories are not subjected to very sort of heavy degree of censorship that we might otherwise expect, given their very sometimes quite explicit or unmistakable content, even where it's not necessarily explicit, as I've just said, it's usually quite unmistakable. So let me just take a, so this is one of the things that I found really compelling about the paper. I'm just reading a book now called Deficits and Desires by Michael Tratner, which looks at forms of erotic desire against the rise of a new regime of consumer culture in the 20th century. And Tratner is careful not to really propose what we might call a causal link. Like Tratner is looking at how new forms of commodity, new forms of commodity culture rise at the same time as new forms of sexual liberation in the 20th century. And he's careful to say, it's not that these two things necessarily one doesn't cause the other, one doesn't, but they both they're mutually representable, they're mutually legible at the same time. And so for Phyllis's paper, it seemed to me that there's a kind of mutual legibility here between a new aesthetic of the short story and a kind of repressive apparatus that would force writers to take on a different approach. And so I found the paper really fantastic in that regard. I've also done some research on the bell in the past, and so this as Boumans' essay brought new stories to my attention, and I think it will do so for a lot of other readers as well. So I highly recommend that paper. And I'll just offer a quick couple of comments on Vegas's paper as well. Sorry, I'm prattling on for so long. I'll be very brief. When Esti's paper arrived and Michael Cronin's paper, I read them both with a lot of interest because I had read At Swim Two Boys, O'Neill's At Swim Two Boys, when it had first come out, and I thought the novel was fantastic, and I recommend it. Michael, I think that maybe you would endorse it. I recommend it as a novel, just as a novel. Like, it's just such a fascinating novel. It's such a great novel, such a brilliantly written novel, and then it happens to be so important besides. And those two things are definitely not separate entities, but it really is just a wonderful novel to read. And after reading Esti's paper, I went back and I've started to reread the novel, and Michael's paper. I'm rereading the novel now, and I'm fascinated by this one thing that Esti puts her finger on really, really incisively in the paper, which is this twin compulsion in the novel between secrecy and genealogy. And those two things seem to be contradictory, where people trying to sort of keep themselves hidden even while they're in plain view, and there's their dodges and weaves and but then genealogy emerges as such an important concern of the novel, and it does so because as Esti explains in her fantastic paper, it does so because the genealogy of the nation and the secret narratives that are occluded by it are going to become predominant concerns of O'Neill's At Swim Two Boys. And so I think Esti's paper does a great job. And one of the things that Laura and I were very interested in from a very early moment in this project is the way in which, there's this stable notion of Irish history as one thing. And then there's feminist Irish history and queer Irish history and this Irish history and that Irish history. And there's this prevailing sense that they don't ever overlap. So real Irish history is only the history of the revolutionary becoming of the nation in 1916, and then the Civil War and very complicated narrative belonging around that, and then the fallout, and then this post-independence period, and et cetera. And so there remains this theoretical and critical conceit that is somehow real Irish history, and all of these other communities have their Irish history too, but doesn't impact, or they have their history, but that's not really Irish history, Irish history or something. And so I think Esti's paper and Michael's paper both do a great job of complicating that narrative, that there is there is really one Irish history. When you look, there really is, and that history, it contains narratives and people and processes and events that are not always condoned by that state narrative, but that is absolutely changing. And so I highly recommend, of course, of Este's paper as well. And I'm going to now ask Michael Cronin to take up. I'm sorry if I've preempted.
Hello, hi there. So hello to everybody. First of all, thank you to Laura and Rob for their work on the issue and for handling everything so efficiently and so gracefully. And apologies for times when I was a bit chaotic in the last few months. And also thanks to the editors of Rise and to the readers as well. And we can all, I found out that we can all have great faith in the anonymity of the peer review process when I got back feedback which recommended that I should include Michael G. Cronin's writing on O'Neill's novel when I revised it. So the first, I'm not, you haven't actually preempted what I was going to say, Rob, in the sense that I'm not really going to get into the detail of the readings. The essay is structured around a close reading of three texts, each of which engages imaginatively with the history of Irish gay men's lives in the 20th century. So Fault Line was a theatre production staged in 2019. It's set in Dublin in 1982. It was created by Anu, the theatre company. Like their other productions, it was site-specific and it was immersive, and it incorporated drama and dance and cabaret. Dennis Keogh's novel Nights Beneath the Nation was published in 2008. The alternate chapters of the novel are set in Dublin in the winter of 1997-98 and the winter of 1950 and 51. And then Jamie O'Neill's novel, A Swim to Boys, was published in 2001, and it's set in Dublin during the year leading up to the 1916 Rising. So one of the questions that I'm pursuing through my reading of these texts is, what are the ethical and political stakes in such literary and imaginative engagements with and creative reconstructions of the Irish queer past? And unsurprisingly, given this is an academic essay, I suppose I argue that this is more complex than we might initially think. So all three texts are created from a standpoint that is liberal, gay affirmative, anti-homophobic. And in the case of Anu, the Anu production, that is clearly sympathetic to the history of Irish LGBT plus political activism from the 1970s. Though I did at the time think that this kind of identification with the history of activism was coming from a position of allyship, which, as Emma Tiberi in her brilliant recent work, focusing more on obviously the context of anti-racism, has encouraged us to contrast with something she calls coalition. And I feel that the Anu production is more on the allyship rather than the coalition side of things. So anyway, the central point is, despite their gay affirmative and anti-homophobic commitments, these texts don't necessarily or don't always express or affirm radical or liberationist perspectives. Okay. So one of the points that I try to reiterate is that in creative and literary works, such as these three, a liberationist rather than a reformist political standpoint is most powerfully expressed through affect and style. So for instance, in terms of story and plot, Nights Beneath the Nation and A Swim to Boys are both tragic romances. Yet the style of the latter, of O'Neill's A Swim, generates, as I heard in the essay, much more radicalizing, much more liberationist affects. One of the ways, for instance, which does that is through the use of intertextuality, which, echoing Rob's point, one of the ways it works is both genealogy, but also the weaving together of currents in Irish history that are thought to be separate, but O'Neill is very keen to sort of bring them together. The history of anti-colonial nationalism and republicanism, and the history of same-sex attraction and desire. So one of the effects of that is use of intertextuality, for instance, is it generates these moments of disruptive queer temporality in the text. Okay, so now while addressing that question, or those related questions, question of the political and ethical stakes of artistic engagements with Irish queer history, the essay also indirectly engages with some questions that are kind of constitute key elements of the larger project that I've been working on for the last few years. So the RISE essay is a sort of distillation from that larger project, which has takes shape, I suppose, in two books, Revolutionary Bodies, which is published in the spring. It's a work of literary criticism. It focuses on the novel. It focuses on the sort of longer view going back to Wilde. And then this other shorter book, which is coming out in September, called Sexual / Liberation, which focuses on what I'm calling the discursive gay man in Irish culture. So in other words, it's not literally, but it's looking at all sorts of sites in culture where this discursive gay man, who of course bears no relation to any actual gay man in the world, circulating in the culture. So Leo Varadkar's media image, advertising, digital profiles of men engaged in sex work, commemoration of Casement in 2016. Actually, the cover image for the RISE issue is one of the texts, and that photograph is one of the things that I work from. So this larger project then, that, as I say, the RISE essay is distilling down from, there are a couple of sort of framing concepts for that project that are, as I say, are at work in the RISE essay. One is the tension between reformism and liberationism. That's a sort of defining, sometimes creative, sometimes destructive antinomy in LGBT+, in the LGBT+ political movement since its emergence as gay liberation and lesbian feminism in the 1970s. That is, its emergence in its contemporary form. Obviously, there were earlier forms of activism. So it's a tension between a minoritarian political standpoint, which seeks equality for a minority within the existing capitalist social order, and on the other hand, a universalist standpoint, which seeks a radically transformed future for everybody, a utopian future in which the current framework of identities we inhabit will be transcended, which is, of course, one of the reasons why it's so difficult to mobilize around liberation. It's very difficult to imagine giving up, so to speak, these identities that feel so necessary, that feel so hard won, and of course are necessary in a sense. They are necessary to be a legible subject, as Judith Butler calls it, in our social order. You've got to have one of these identities. There's a small digression here. In a sense, the strange career of trajectory of the concept of queer since the late 80s, early 90s kind of illustrates that point about the difficulty of giving up identities. Queer started out in queer activism, queer academic work, queer theory, as a concept and as a strategy for undermining, deconstructing, challenging, interrogating identities. But now, all these years later, we use it as an adjective. I used it myself as an adjective, I think, a few minutes ago. And when we're not using it as an adjective, very ironically, we're using it as a category of identity. That's the reason why I use LGBT+, and I dropped the Q, because in a sense, it doesn't make sense to me to include Q as an identity among a sort of range or multiplicity of identities, since from the get-go it was about challenging identity. I realize that makes me, irredeemably Gen X because of, being nostalgic for the 90s and whatnot, but there you go. To develop this concept of liberationism, I'm interested in returning to radical currents in the earlier and mid-20th century, to pre-Foucault, for want of a better word. Two theorists of liberation that I found especially energizing are Herbert Marcuse and Ernst Bloch. Okay, so then I mapped that tension, reformism, liberationism, onto two other interrelated distinctions: identities and bodies, and injury and vulnerability. So to theorize the latter distinction, injury and vulnerability, I drew on Wendy Brown and Judith Butler. So Brown demonstrates that injury is the defining affect of identity politics. She outlines the contradictions, the limitations this imposes on our political demands. For instance, by seeking inclusion in an unjust social order, we are thereby affirming that social order by desiring inclusion in it. Or by seeking recognition of an identity that is rooted in abjection and injury, we are somehow accepting that this injury can never be transcended. In seeking recognition for it, we are accepting that we will always be defined by it. Another digression: as someone who identifies as a gay man, because we have to use one of these identities to exist in the world, I find currently the depiction and the self-presentation of gay men in contemporary popular culture really incredibly kind of dispiriting. There's a constant reiteration that what defines this identity is not the joy and pleasure of loving and fucking men, but being traumatized, whatever that might mean. So we've got liberationism, reformism, we've got we've got vulnerability and injury, and then drawing on Butler, the idea of the body. So Butler's argument, I suppose, is that we can most effectively challenge the ideological dominant, the political rationality of neoliberalism, by organizing around a transformative and universalist political vision that wouldn't be premised on the autonomy and identity of the sovereign subject, but on the condition of vulnerability and dependence intrinsic to the human body. So in capsule form, I guess what I've been trying to do in the Rise essay and in the two books is to map those spaces in Irish queer and homoerotic literary and creative work where the body is imaginatively foregrounded rather than identity, where vulnerability is the most compelling affect rather than injury, and thus where the liberationist political imaginary is most powerfully operative. Okay, thanks very much.
Michael Wyden.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for Michael and Nisha for two very interesting topics. It's always hard to follow people in situations like this, so thank you very much for making it difficult for me. Thank you also to Rob and Laura for really was a very pleasurable experience working on the journal. So thank you very much for that, and to Seán and to those at EFACIS for continual support over the years in many aspects. My paper, and I'll be brief on it, it began life in COVID isolation and a kind of the dull days of waiting out the 2-kilometer walk from your home and what to do and where to go. And I was just coming to the end of writing an article on Sinead O'Connor, and this idea of a popular representation of transnationalized Irishness became a kind of a focal point of looking at O'Connor, and the idea emerged of it from that about where in Ireland today, or in transnational representations of Irishness today, where who would take that same mantle? What it would be a performer, a woman in particular, that would fill the same kind of idea. So I was looking really at kind of film and I think my own area of research would be music studies. So I was looking towards aspects of music, looking towards aspects of film, looking at sports, I was looking towards Katie Taylor, and then I came across an article about WWE wrestling, professional wrestling. This and performer Becky Lynch, who was the first woman ever to headline WrestleMania. And those of you not familiar with WrestleMania, they refer to it as the showcase of the immortals, this grand stage and sort of this huge melodrama that is sports entertainment. And from what I knew watching professional wrestling as a child years ago, is there really wasn't a place for women in that narrative. Jenkins, who referred to in the article, refers to professional wrestling as a masculine melodrama. This sort of world where everything is overstated. There's very little room for subtlety or in any forms. It's very clear narrative driven about, you know, good versus evil, or heels versus baby faces, as it's written, or as it's described in the narratives. And within that, women were primarily used as props, you know, devices in some ways to kind of progress the narrative of the male characters. So I was quite struck that this Irish woman from Limerick, former air stewardess for Aer Lingus, was in this really, really prominent position, you know, in front of a live audience of 80,000 in a huge stadium, and these grand stages that the professional wrestling shows 2 years before, in front of a live audience of 103,000 in a very, very similar role, but not headlining. So I was kind of struck with really her narrative to get to that stage. And it looked at kind of two aspects, the first of which was looking towards, firstly, the representation, the very, very long problematic representation of women within professional wrestling, going back to the sort of carnivalesque tricks, you know, days of, circus performances where they have rings set up, and looking at these kind of aspects when it was taken as a serious, you know, I use the word fake is a very, very problematic term in professional wrestling studies, but this, you know, it was taken as a serious sport at the time, and women were very much at that point painted as kind of almost kind of a sideshow freak attraction. In the article, I referred to the jargon of professional wrestling referred to them as cunt shows. You know, excuse my use of problematic language, but that's the you know, how they refer to within the early narratives of wrestling. So to go from that up towards, as I said, kind of a side attraction, or at best a side attraction, and the reality is for much of the 90s and the sort of you know, really sexually derogative, you know, representation of women within sports entertainment. So how really Lynch was able to emerge in that. So I then look at the position her towards at the end of that. But I also wanted to also represent the Irish representation within professional wrestling as well. And sort of, again, going back to the very simplistic narratives of professional wrestling, where there's often American virtue or North American virtue faced against, you know, foreign foes and so on. And often the Irish representation, it fits in the kind of, you know, the foreign foe, where you know, British. I'm watching too much Boris Johnson today. With it, American baby faces have to fight off, you know, various different invading foes. So I kind of want to fit the narrative in that. And what I found really interesting about the Becky Lynch character, and I'll finish up on this point, is the representation of Lynch's rise emerged when she started using the moniker The Man, and started kind of taking on the traits of sort of hegemonic masculine identities within, taken from male characters, particularly from a hyper aggressive attitude that was seen in an awful lot of Irish characters. So by using that, it sort of created her platform where there was an audience appreciation that resulted within her rise within the sport or sports entertainment as called. So it was a little bit off my own area. While I'm currently working on a research project where I'm looking at doing an audit of contemporary music in Ireland, and looking at the gender breakdown of composer opportunities for men and women over the last 15 years. So it was a nice relief to escape the spreadsheets and to delve into the world of professional wrestling as a form of escapism, which I think ultimately is what some of the most enjoyable aspects of working on it. But that's it. I won't say any more. It's all in the article. People can have a read. So, and again, thank you very much for the opportunity. It was a very enjoyable process of working.
Thank you very much. So it was we thought at the end of it we would make room for some questions and answer, question and answer, of course, but also if there were any other, if there were any areas there where people were curious about the ways in which the papers work together, or if had any thoughts about really any aspect of what they've heard today. We would just love to hear some comments from the contributors or from people who have joined the event. So we'll turn it over now for questions and answers. I do have a question for Michael Cronin about your paper. One of the articles that I teach in my 200 level class on Marxism is an article by Cara and Elizabeth called Reading Dialectically. And I have to say, I think in future iterations of that course, I might use your essay as an illustration of reading dialectically, because, and this in and of itself might not be what I'm calling what for me was a very enlightening moment reading your article. So to say that O'Neill's novel is about the 1990s more, as much as or more than or whatever than it is about 1916 might seem trivial enough, but to go on to argue, and I wouldn't say it's trivial, but I would just say that it might be a commonplace, right? It might be something like, well, of course, this novel is about the time and place where it's where it's published, as much as it's about the history that it's taking on, this revolutionary moment in 1916, of course. But then to go on to look at how the novel quite carefully parses out in your reading a liberationist versus a reformist moment that is absolutely essential to understanding the development of queer subjectivity at this time, and in the decades, and in the decade or so prior to that, or just more. I think that is just and then to find that expressed on the level of form, I thought was just absolutely brilliant in your essay. I can't tell you how much I enjoyed that. So I don't know if all of that is just a bunch of blather, or if that was, if I'm anywhere close to the essay, but yeah.
Well, first of all, thanks, Rob. It's very kind and very generous what you have to say about the article. And I'm always trying to explain to my students what dialectic means, and I struggle. So to be told that I'm doing it is encouraging. And also, I mentioned in passing, sort of as a joke, the reviewer mentioning why my own article wasn't there. And in a way, I kind of didn't want it to be there, because it was one of the fascinating things about writing about Swim Two Boys, for the book, Revolutionary Bodies, and then for this article. And really, it's actually in 2004, I think, in Era Ireland, I wrote about it, situating it very much within the context of the time, the context of the emergence of the category we can call Irish gay fiction after 1993. And I was very hard on the novel there. I was reading it very much as a novel of its time, a novel that was, in a sense, in a novel that was in some ways in sort of conformity, despite itself. Despite itself, it was actually in conformity with the kind of neoliberal rhetoric and the sort of the neoliberal dominant of Celtic Tiger Ireland. It was a novel that made Celtic Tiger Ireland feel good about itself. Look how we've sort of progressed. We can contrast the past with the present. We can take these two narratives. We can take the narrative of the state, the narrative of Ireland with 1916 as its origin point, and we can comfortably incorporate into that narrative this other strand of the history of same-sex passion, same-sex desire. And it makes us feel here is an image of modern, multicultural Celtic Tiger Ireland that we can all congratulate ourselves about. Then I didn't sort of think much about the novel for a long time, and then I started writing about it. And it was one of the most pleasurable and exciting moments in writing and working on that book, because it's so rare when you're a middle-aged academic to have a new idea, as opposed to kind of finding new ways of reiterating the same ideas. When I realized as I was working on it, I was coming up with an entirely different reading of this novel than I once held. And I think, as you mentioned, as you rightly point out, astutely point out, the difference, one of the difference, what allowed me to develop this quite different reading, which saw a sort of much more liberationist, I guess, much more radical potential or perspectives in this novel, was paying more attention to the form, well, not the form, to, in a sense, to the style, to the aesthetics. That when you pay attention, when we pay very sort of attention to the story, we end up with, you know, here's the story of 1916, here's the story of two boys in love, a love story of two boys. We transplant one on top of the other, and, you know, here is some sort of attempt to fuse these two narratives, the narrative of the nation, the narrative of same-sex marriage. But once we start to pay attention to the actual sort of text and sort of to the oddness, and as you say, it is a very fun novel to read. It's also sort of bonkers and huge and goes all over the place and has all sorts of knowing asides and kind of heavy-handed at times to Joyce and to this and that, and, you know, the history of Irish Republican ballads and a whole lot, everything is sort of in there. And every political perspective imaginable in 1916 is in there, represented by one of the characters. And every aspect of the debates around homosexuality, you know, from the going on there post-Wilde, late 19th, early 20th century, they're all in there, all the perspectives. So it's completely bonkers in one way, but in another way, it's fascinating when you pay attention to the stuff, and which again, the ways in which the novel shows identity, both Irish identity, in this moment of sort of flux, not fixed, flux, debate, openness, you know, from the most reactionary wing represented by the priest Father Taylor to the, you know, radical socialist Republican version of Irish nationalism represented by Connolly and represented by Doyle in the novel, and the whole gamut across are in there. And so there's that whole sense of openness, that whole sense of possibilities. And I suppose that's, in a sense, you know, when you come to the style of a novel with strange, kind of mad, all over the place intertextual references and allusions and characters representing all sorts of perspectives, and they're all crammed in there, it creates a sense of history as open, a sense of history as fluid and flexible and plastic. And going back to the dialectic, that's what Lukács says, you know, the best historical novels do. Even the ones written by terrible conservatives like Balzac or Walter Scott. It doesn't really matter about the politics of the author. What matters is if the novel doesn't tell us what history was like, but leaves us with some sense of history is something we can do something about. We can mobilize to change history because it is open and fluid and plastic.
Yeah, thank you. That was great. I don't know if anybody has any further questions. We are, yeah.
If I could
Naoise, please
jump in with something else for Michael. I was really struck by what you said about intertextuality and disrupted temporality in your reading of the novel, and I wondered if you have wanted to add any thoughts about the kind of decade of centenaries commemoration culture. And it's really interesting to hear that you kind of had an entirely new reading of a novel that you had previously kind of like characterized in that way. Because yeah, I've been thinking so much about the kind of question of temporality in these commemorations, and the kind of, I suppose I'm looking a lot at this category of kind of women writers, and like, but I think they're kind of the women thing and the gay thing like have a lot of overlaps, and the kind of self-congratulatory like yada 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 thing in commemoration. But yeah, I just would be really interested to hear your thoughts on that kind of contemporary moment.
Thanks, Naoise. And it is a really important, and it is, okay, maybe the best way I can answer this is to recommend a book, but it's a small book. It's part of that series that I mentioned, the one that I'm publishing, Sexual Liberation. It's a series called Sharach, published by Cork. The subtitle is Longings for Another Ireland. So it's basically, it's sort of, somebody takes a topic and sort of writes a relatively short, so we're kind of a little bit less constrained by the kind of rules of academic writing. But anyway, in that there's a book called Commemoration by Heather Laird. And for my money, it is by far the most interesting and insightful analysis of the dynamics of commemoration, because I think commemoration has been fascinating because there are these kind of twin impulses at the same time. You know, the state impulse is all about a fixed narrative, you know, a fixed kind of narrative, basically a sort of narrative that is sort of safe, that is stability. There was this time in the past when people could, you know, go out and challenge the state, but you know, they got the job done. Of course, now it wouldn't dawn on us to go out and challenge the state in any way, because, you know, that was then. So it's a way, it's this, the state in this kind of strange position of having to commemorate its inception in a moment of rebellion, while at the same time sort of placing the very notion of rebellion or resistance or dissidence as something safely in the past, not something that we do now. But then, of course, there was all sorts of things going on during it that were sort of challenging the sort of state narrative, the state version. So in a sense, while the commemorations, whether it is commemorations or that whole sort of decade, because I don't think the decade, of course, the state version of the decade was very dominant, but I don't think it necessarily, and the deeply conservative version of commemoration was going on there. I don't think that was the whole story. I think it did create a space for all sorts of other things going on. One of the things I was looking at was as I mentioned, was Roger Casement. And I was sort of reading Casement's, what I do is sort of read Casement's own diaries against how he's sort of commemorated in 2016. But again, how he's commemorated is itself sort of very volatile. He's a figure, you know, in a way that Pearce or Connolly hasn't been as attractive to historians, but also interestingly writers, artists. You know, within a few months in 2016, there was a dance production, there was a sonata, there was an art exhibition, like within literally 3 months about sort of Casement. So he became this figure, but again, it could be very conservative. The gay patriot. Aren't we great now? It was terrible in the past, but now the gay patriot. This is how Leo Varadkar, I think. Sorry, I can't remember the name of the person, the contributor who wrote about at Swim as well, mentions his speech. Leo Varadkar gave this speech.
Yeah.
It was a state apology on the anniversary of decriminalization, and he uses word about sort of gay patriots in Casement. But it was such a fascinating moment. Casement, when you read him, is so like this. What makes him fascinating is this incredibly radical critique of global capitalism, of this emergent world system, and all the exploitation it brings about. And here is this political leader who, you know, loves Google, loves whatever, all the big tech companies coming to Ireland, who is totally committed to the capitalist world system that Roger Casement was absolutely opposed to. And yet somehow he can be incorporated into the vision. He can be incorporated into precisely the political standpoint, as it were, that Casement himself reiterated. And one of the things that facilitates that is his sexuality, is our ideas about his sexuality, because he can become the gay patriot. So, sorry, I'm not sure that that's answering anyway, Naoise, but Heather's Laird's book is really interesting in the topic, so you can look into that.
Great.
Thanks. As a follow-up to that, actually, I have an article coming out in a couple of weeks on the commemoration of 1916 rising in popular music, and it leans quite heavily on Laird's article. It's really interesting, but it's it's a really just that's also under EFACIS publication, I believe, in a couple ICE in a couple of weeks' time. So.
Oh, great! Thank you. Yeah, I'll look for that. Yeah, wonderful.
I actually had I don't know if there are other questions out there, but I had a question for the other Michael Lydon as well too. Michael, I was thinking a bit more about, I've obviously read the article now a number of times, but I was thinking a little bit more about the figure of the man, or Becky Lynch herself, and whether or not, I know it's not maybe your area of expertise as much as music is, but I'm wondering if you feel how successful she is in her kind of appropriation of traditional masculinity versus how much she's consumed or reconsumed by a kind of neoliberalist branding. So yeah, it was something that I had wanted yeah, just to know a bit more about, I thought she was such a fascinating character, such an interesting perspective. I don't know that much about wrestling, so it was interesting to read character from a very different perspective.
Yeah, no, there's no subtlety in our representation of masculinity. It is Conor McGregor times to 11. It's that sort of overt thing. Again, it's that whole aspect about what professional wrestling is. It's the overemphasis on everything. So, yeah. So from that way, it's kind of interesting in terms of her. Interestingly, from the article, since the article was published, actually, she's no longer goes by the moniker, because she was sued by another professional wrestler that used to use the name a man used to refer to himself as the man. So that's also not going to be an interesting kind of subplot to kind of the aspect. But no, there's very little. Her representation of it would be Irish masculinity is, think of all the overt, popular representations of Irish masculinity, whether it be the Fighting Irish, whether all these things, they all tie into that. There's very little as comes in. There's other characters, other figures within represent in professional wrestling that have a far more subtle way of doing it. So just in terms of there's another promotion, and this is something that I found when I was looking. I wouldn't know a huge amount myself when I started doing the research, but just kind of get digging into thing. But there's another promotion that started a couple of years ago too. That's also having game levels of success. But their current women's champion is a trans woman, trans Native American athlete. Again, it's something that was never referenced. It's something it's not part of any kind of a plot line or any kind of a story. It's just part of the person's identity. It's not strictly stated, but it's sort of an interesting kind of narrative with. And the word I actually found quite an interesting subject in terms of professional wrestling is a sort of interesting space in that there's a line I read in another article about it where it's a kind of no world theater where everybody's aware that what's happening is this melodrama. Everybody's in on the act. Everybody's in on and the appreciation is kept for a performer is not necessary to do with his or her story arc, but it's their ability to get that story arc out there. That is where the real kind of aspect comes. So these kind of meta narratives that are ultimately intertwined. But yeah, I hope I answered your question. But yeah, there's very little. It's worth looking. I mean, there's a video I mentioned at the start of the article where I talk about when she was introduced during one of their gaming. I think it's like, PS5 or whatever, these gaming consoles where there was a WWE game, and again the lack of subtlety is she literally breaks through the glass ceiling into a room full of men and starts acting in an overt way, grabbing drinks from people, and it's all that is kind of tied into it. But yeah, that's a good way to illustrate really the character.
Yeah, so I guess my follow-up to that is just thinking about WWE more broadly is to what extent is it liberationist, right? What are the possibilities for liberation within that particular space of culture?
Yeah, it's a good question. And there's been a lot written about it. One of the things I found quite interesting when I started the article is how much written about WWE, about representations across it. And, this idea of brand casting is ultimately whether or not it ties into this, the narrative is ultimately down to, Lynch's character ascends to this space, but that ultimately washes up all of the industry-wide, complacency over things. So it's very little accountability for the industry or for people around it. Is ultimately to do with the personal narrative to get to that place. So again, that ties into the kind of more traditional, neoliberal, feminist brand casting kind of, washing that kind of comes almost synonymous with particularly American popular culture.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
This isn't really a question so much for Naoise as it is just a comment. I have to confess, prior to reading your paper, I've taught Bowen in a number of classes, and I love teaching. Students love Bowen's fiction, and and her short fiction and the novels as well. But when I teach her, I've been guilty in the past of seeing her as a writer who felt like under siege in an Ireland that was quickly making less room for the social category that she seemed to embody, class and ascendancy, Protestantism and stuff. And so I've seen her as a writer who felt adjacent to the narrative of the nation because she was being dispossessed by it. But your paper has opened up a whole, like, dispossessed by that sort of nationalist narrative, more so than by the many ways in which you trace that the figure of the queer transnational embodies. So thank you very much for I'm hopefully I haven't been oblivious to the things that you, but I know that in my teaching I've prioritized a different vision of Bowen, and your paper offered a really great corrective, or at least definitely a new way for me to examine a figure that whose fiction I absolutely love too. Yeah, so thanks.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you for that. And I think they're not contradictory narratives.
No,
like
no,
I
they're
am
not.
increasingly working to, as I'm still writing on Bowen and like dwelling on those post-war years where she flees socialist England after World War II, and writes some very interesting things about about Ireland and the value of the conservatism that she finds there. And trying to reconcile that with what I think there is also in her novels, a like intensely queer disruptive style. Where does that come from? But I think it's really important, I suppose, to me to not disavow the really elitist and really conservative places that queer culture has come from, and that is part of our story. As much as I was almost taken aback when the journal issue title kind of came out in an email, and I was like, oh, liberation, is that what I'm writing about? I suppose it is, yes. But there's something much stickier there, I think, about where sources of liberatory aesthetics have come from, have always been bound up in writers like that, and in people who have been much more complex than simply kind of revolutionary or exactly the reformist liberatory dichotomy that Michael is outlining.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you very much for that. Really appreciate it. Great. Well, thanks everyone, and again, thanks to Seán and the journal staff and everyone at EFACIS. It's been a wonderful project. We're looking forward to number 2 for the second of the 2 issues as well, and it's just been an absolutely fantastic experience all around. So thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much to the contributors. You put in so much hard work and responded to all of our email requests last minute as well too, with grace and humility. We're so grateful for the work that you've done.
Thanks. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Laura. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Naoise, Michael Cronin and Michael Lydon, and to all of the other contributors who couldn't be with us tonight, and of course to all of our attendees here too, for joining us for this launch. I found it really a fascinating insight into the issue and into broader issues, I think, around Irish society, culture, literature, and indeed WWE. And the way in which Irishness has become incorporated into that, in the contemporary manifestation of WWE and the figure of Becky Lynch, this extraordinary figure of Becky Lynch. So thank you all. As Rob alluded to there just at the end, the next issue of Rise, issue 5.2, will be part 2 of Irish sexual liberation and its literature. So we're all really looking forward to that issue, which will be issued later this year. As I mentioned at the beginning, we're also, as always, welcoming proposals for further themed issues. If you have a topic that you'd like us to consider, please do email me at rise@efacis.eu. And equally, if you have an article you'd like us to consider for consideration in a non-themed issue, and we're expediting the process for publications around that, and a new format that will be coming shortly next month that will allow for articles, individual articles, to be published on our website more quickly once they've been through the peer review process. So if you have an article you'd like to consider in the broader area of Irish studies, please do send that also to rise@efacis.eu. And thank you all for joining us, and hopefully we will have the pleasure of your company again at another launch for part 2 later this year.